Hello everyone, this is Pepperfish and I am back with a new podcast, this time to talk a little bit about the dangers of imagining a story before you actually read a story. And this does of course happen with videos, movies and that sort of thing too, but for the most part, most of my trouble comes with books. So to give you some perspective about what I'm talking about today, what often happens with me is I go out, I'm looking for a new book to read, and I will read, of course, like everyone, the back cover copy. So that's the blurb, on the back of a book. And what you have is, a little blurb that will essentially try to entice you to read it. So, and most of these blurbs will give you basic information about the book, including who the main characters are, where is it located, what is their main, struggle hinted at, And so essentially what happens for me is that I will start to imagine the whole story of the book in my head the moment I read the back cover or hear about the premise of the story or something like that. So, essentially what I think the problem is for me is that there is a certain amount of formula to most genre fiction, and I have the most experience with romance, so I, honestly pick up on certain cues that are given to us on the on these back covers, or when people give me tell me the story or whatever. And so I pick up on the cues, and like I said, we'll imagine the whole story based on the cues and, insert name here and all of that. So this leads me to trouble, of course, because sometimes I will get a book that is not what I thought it was going to be. Most of the time I'm totally open for anything that's new and, hey, this isn't following the formula, or this is just taking a different direction. I didn't think about that. And sometimes it's really exciting, but every now and then it isn't exciting, okay? Sometimes what I want is not what I get, and it's not, it's just frustrating. So, first example for today, I wanted this one time to read smut, okay? I was in college, I wanted smut, okay? And so I was looking for a new book. I had a new author that I'd never read before, and this is usually what gets me into trouble as well, when you have something that's unfamiliar, but I'm going to give it a try, which is, troubling when what I really wanted was something very, very basic. I wanted sexy times. So this is the back cover blurb that I read, and this is for the book Fantasy Lover. So this book is by Sherilyn Kenyon. Like I said, I hadn't read any of her stuff before. So this is the back cover. Dear reader, being trapped in a bedroom with a woman is a grand thing. Being trapped in hundreds of bedrooms over 2,000 years isn't. And being cursed into a book as a love slave for eternity can ruin even a Spartan warrior's day. As a love slave, I knew everything about women, how to touch them, how to savor them, and most of all, how to pleasure them. But when I was summoned to fulfill Grace Alexander's sexual fantasies, I found the first woman in history who saw me as a man with a tormented past. Of course she did. She alone, of course, bothered to take me out of the bedroom and into the world. She taught me to love again. But I was not born to know love. I was cursed to walk eternity alone. As a general, I had long ago accepted my sentence, yet now I have found grace, the one thing my wounded heart cannot survive without. Sure, love can heal all wounds, but can it break a 2,000-year-old curse? And it's signed Julian of Macedon, which, of course, is the hero of the story. So, I'm totally thinking, ooh, she gets a love slave, and they're going to have sexy times, and maybe break the curse. This will be great. And, oh yeah, so this is what happens when I actually open the book, start to read it. And this is spoilers, okay, just to warn you, spoilers. I start to read the story, and the heroine gets the book, doesn't realize that it's, cursed and all that, because it's all modern times, and she ends up opening it up, releasing poor Julian into the world, and he is now her love slave. And she's, of course, freaked out. And unlike all the other women for hundreds of years, because, you know, somehow none of those other women were also freaked out. No. She's the only one. And she, like, instead of, you know, ravaging him, like like anyone else, it seems, for hundreds of years has done, she decides that, you know, she will, you know, maybe help him break the curse, right? So I'm just like, okay, fine. It turns out that he will be her love slave for a month. So I'm thinking like, okay, they have a month to let the chemistry build. She'll get used to him, and then it'll be sexy times for the rest of the month. So I'm just like, woohoo, you know, let's get to this already. While they, you know, go out and they try to figure out how to break the curse or whatever. So I, of course, I'm just like, okay, you know, fine. This is normal fantasy formula, you know, let them build up their chemistry. And of course, the frustration, the disconnect, the wrongness, the unhappiness comes when they do find out how they should break the curse, okay? So the way to do it, again, spoilers, they have to wait to have sex until the end of the month. I mean, they have to go the whole month without any sexy times, okay? We are talking no smut for a month worth of book story here. And then they have to have sex, like, for the last hour or something like that. Like when the clock turns midnight or something like that, they have to be having sexy times, but they can't have sexy times before that, okay? And seriously, when I read that, toss, gone, fly across the room. I think it hit my bookshelf and fell to the floor, okay? That is how frustrated I was when I read that. So, again, I had read the back of the book, imagined a whole story in my head, thought it was, you know, I was going to get what I wanted, and did not. So, obviously, my bad. I, you know, really should not have gone with a unfamiliar author when I wanted, you know, when I probably very likely had authors who could have given me what I wanted. And this is to say that the book itself is not a bad fantasy romance. You know, it is not a bad book, and certainly Sherilyn Kenyon's other books. This is sort of a semi-prequel to the Dark Hunter series. And that series is great and, you know, totally has plenty of sexy times. But I seriously was so pissed off when I read this book. And I finished it, okay? I finished it. But I was so pissed off. And it just wasn't what I wanted in that moment of time. And I had fooled myself because of the stupid back cover copy into thinking that it would be. So obviously, partially, you know, shame on me for that, but also I'm still a little annoyed at the writers of that back cover copy. So that's one issue, or one example. So I think, you know, part of it again is this mix of wanting certain familiar things, but also, you know, the intrigue of getting certain things that are unfamiliar. So, another example, this was actually another time, it wasn't the back cover copy that fooled me. It was a friend of mine who told me the premise to a book that she had read and she had bought, and she gave it to me to read. She's like, I think you would like this. Here, you know, go ahead. So she tells me the story, the premise of the story, and it's basically this, okay? During late medieval Scotland, it's been a while, so I may not get all the details correct, but during late medieval Scotland, you have two twins, both male, and they sort of rule over their land or whatever. And essentially, you have this woman who comes in and she's not from around there, and there's this prophecy that she has to choose between the two twins, and she can either, you know, choose one or the other. And the prophecy basically says that whoever she chooses will like be the leader of the group, you know, of the territory and all that, and all the people there. And essentially she, you know, kind of has this big decision, and part of the issue is that one of the brothers, and we don't know who, one of the brothers will lead the people into war. And there would also be the other brother would lead the people into peace. And you don't really know which brother would lead them into what, so she has to make this big decision. And honestly, this sounded like a really kind of interesting book. I was like, oh, this could be really great. Maybe, you know, you would have all this great like back and forth, and maybe she would think that it would be at first that this guy, maybe he's really obvious and he's like the golden, awesome, like everyone loves him twin, and then you have the dark brooding twin, and so you're like, oh, who knows, maybe it will be this one. And then you think, okay, this guy's the good one, the other one's evil, but then you find out that no, that guy's actually really good and the other one's evil. And then maybe it would go back and forth and you would never know, and she would finally decide based on her heart and all this crap, right? So I totally had all this craziness in my head, and get the book, started to get, you know, some warnings in the blurb on the back cover that it might not be exactly the book that I was thinking, but it totally had all the, you know, that yes, there was a prophecy, there's a woman who comes into this, you know, land, and blah, blah, blah. So part of the issue, of course, is that, you know, it just was not the book that I thought it was. And basically, I start to read the book, and the premise of the book in actuality is there is a woman. She goes to this place. There are twin brothers. There is a prophecy. So most of the information, the basic details is correct. But it turns out that she doesn't have to choose between either of the brothers. She naturally falls in love with the younger brother, and it turns out the prophecy says that when this, you know, woman from another place comes, it is a sign that the brothers will lead their people into war and bring them back, and afterwards there would be decades of peace. So I'm like, what? You know, this is not the story I was thinking of in my head, okay? You know, perfectly fine romance novel, you know, I did finish it, you know, but I was so disappointed that it wasn't the story that I had thought of. And in the end, you know, I just really was like, I want to read that story about two twins, and maybe one's evil, maybe one's not, and who knows which is which and all of that. So it was, you know, disappointment. And of course my own friend who didn't quite tell me the premise correctly the first time, that obviously did not help. But sometimes, like I said, you really imagine the whole story, and you want to walk that path. You want to take that journey with that story, and then it isn't in the end what you get. So, you know, like I said, a number of times I've been disappointed in this way, where, you know, the story itself just turns out to be either, you know, just kind of boring, or, you know, just not as epic as what you come up with in your head. But every now and then you actually get the opposite. So I do have one example of a book that was actually way, way better than I imagined. So I guess I should say that I am not a fantasy reader. I very, very rarely read high fantasy novels. And, you know, this one point in time, I wanted to try out this one particular book. It's called Battle Axe. In the original publication in Australia, the title is Battle Axe, but in America, they actually gave the first book the title of the whole series, which is The Wayfarer Redemption by Sarah Douglas. And so The Wayfarer Redemption is essentially the book that you would find here in America. And it's the first of 6 books. But it, you know, it had an interesting cover. And on the cover, you basically have a young girl who has like a sword strapped to her back, but she basically is wearing like Princess Leia slave girl clothing. You know, very thin material with like leather and metal, you know, sort of added accessories and stuff like that. And I was just like, oh, that's kind of interesting. And she's sort of squatting down at this, mystical like fountain thing in the floor. So I'm just like, oh, this is, kind of intriguing. And this is the blurb that I got in the back of the back cover. Okay. So the Wayfarer Redemption, here we go. For 1,000 years, the Akarites have lived prosperous lives protected by vast and insurmountable mountains and the powerful Seneschal, guardians of mysterious way of the plow and intermediaries with the great god Artor. But now Akar security is threatened as a millennia-old prophecy predicting the return of the Forbidden Ones flares into life. An unnatural winter grips the land as the Ice Lord Gorgrial, oh my gosh, that name, seriously, moves his armies of demonic wraiths and ice worms south. Akor crumbles under Gorgrial's murderous onslaught. It seems that no one can stop him. Faraday, betrothed of Akar's warlord, Duke Bornheld, is as frightened as everyone else. While fleeing to safety with Axis, legendary leader of the Axe Wielders and hated half-brother of Bornheld, Faraday learns that all she has been taught about her people's history has been based on lies. Leaving the company of Axis, a man she secretly loves, although it would mean his death to reveal it, Faraday embarks on a journey that will forever change both her life and those of her people. So, The Wayfarer Redemption is the beginning of an epic fantasy about honor, family, and love. A Faraday's fight for one man's love and their struggles to free the people from the lies that have bound them and lead them into the truth of the Stargate. So, very intriguing blurb for me to read. And again, I was unfamiliar with the genre. I'm still fairly unfamiliar with the genre. So, I'm kind of basing it off of sort of romance formula that I was thinking in my head, but I started to build this story and, it's kind of like, oh, okay, so you have this girl Faraday and she totally loves this guy, but she can't like really love him technically because of, the situation and all of that. So I'm totally coming up with all this crazy shenanigans, right? And just to give you some perspective on the size of the story, this is the first book of 6, and the first book is 600 pages. So I probably should have known that it was going to be more complicated than what I was thinking in my head. So ended up reading the book and was so blown away with how different the story is. And I'm going to tell you, spoiler alert right now, but it does not take the path that I thought it was. So I totally thought that she was going to end up with this guy Axis, but that is not what happens. It's actually, she has a much different trajectory. Her path is so different. And Axis actually falls in love with somebody else, and it's this, that they have this other totally crazy adventures, and it's such a, it's one of those really complicated, multi-character type of high fantasy novels, so it was way complicated and so good, and I really enjoyed the story. I ended up only reading the first 3 books because they're kind of split into 2 trilogies, that kind of thing. Anyway, so sometimes you get a book and it turns out to be way better and way more than, you think originally. And part of that, of course, is the fact that it was unfamiliar and I was open to any sort of interesting plot at the time. And I wasn't just looking for something familiar in unfamiliar places. It is interesting, just the general concept of imagining stories before you read the stories. And I know that a lot of people fantasize about ways that they could make a story better, and I definitely do that, because there are times where I'm like, yeah, this story was unsatisfying, and what would have made it more interesting to me is if, this other thing would have happened, or if this person actually acted like this, later on, or whatever. And of course, this is essentially the heart of fanfic, where you have all these people, all the fans writing their own versions of stories or introducing themselves into the stories or getting characters to behave in different ways and all of that. But I think it is interesting how, for me though, is that even just a small little blurb is enough to sort of pique my storytelling in my head, like my story building in my head. And sometimes you do get books that will be what I want and will rival the story that I have in my head, and sometimes they won't, or they just won't be what I need at that moment. And I have, in the end, major respect for any author, because those stories, thousands of stories are published every year, particularly just in the genre of romance, and that is somebody's story, and I feel like they do have all the rights to that story, and I totally understand, wanting to protect your own stories, but I do have mad respect for everything that that writers do in, expressing these stories, but I also respect the fact that we can all have our own story in our head. And I totally realize as well that what may be interesting and maybe something that somebody else would love is not going to be necessarily what I want or what I need, or what I'm interested in hearing. And I kind of love that, that we are capable of having so much variety just as human beings in our stories and stuff like that. So whether or not it all gets published, probably not. Definitely not. But it is, it's an interesting things about humans. I definitely think I could probably do a whole other podcast about the issue of taking somebody else's story and really building a whole new story off of it, or, the whole fan fiction thing. I could definitely do a whole podcast on that. I don't know if I ever will, but it's definitely an interesting and a juicy topic. But anyways, I want to leave or end this podcast with a quick recommendation to everyone to, try out that book that perhaps doesn't actually seem to meet your needs, because you never know, it may, and to be kind and honest, to be respectful of the authors when their books actually don't meet your needs. Because as much as we may, come to hate a certain author sometimes, if that's where they want to take the story, that's where it ends up going. So anyways, that's about it, and have a good weekend.